Hi, guys. This is Dr. Ellie again from my podcast, I Heal Kids. And we're here today with sixth grade English language arts teacher with over 7 years experience in educating youth, and also my husband, Mr. Jeffrey Root. How are you today?
I'm fantastic. How you doing, my love?
Great. And who do you heal?
I heal students.
Great. And how long have you been doing this kind of work?
7 years now, on and off, from subbing beginning to being a paraeducator to working in special ed as a classroom assistant, and then to being a middle school and high school English teacher. So
Amazing. Well, thanks for joining me today. I wanted to make sure that we talked about the intersection of health and education, so I really appreciate you being here. Also have a dog barking issue that we'll edit out later, or maybe not, depending on my mood.
that's our life.
Yes. So in any case, I wanted to talk a little bit about navigating adolescence. So, as many people know, in adolescence during puberty, which commonly occurs in the middle school years, kids go through a lot of changes. And some of those include growth spurts, like rapid height increases, weight can increase, limbs may actually grow faster than the torso, leading to awkwardness. And of course, in girls, breast development, hip widening, menstruation. And in boys, testicular growth, penile growth, voice deepening, facial hair development, acne becomes a thing. Girls tend to gain a bit more body fat. Boys generally gain more muscle. And then there's, of course, a shift in circadian rhythms, which can cause, an issue with the ability for teens to be able to fall asleep early. So all of those can be problematic moving into middle school. And in addition, there's also a lot of separation from the parental group that starts happening around this time when students start looking to their peers more rather than their parents for support. So I'm curious, Mr. Jeffrey Root, how do you address all of these changes as a teacher in the classroom? How do you see them manifesting, and how can we best support kids at this age?
Oh man, that's a loaded question. I think we'll have to break that down topic by topic. But what I see manifest, it's interesting because I get them when they come in at around 11 years old. And by the time they exit my classroom at 12 years old, they are very different people. I mean, you see massive growth spurts, differences in attitude, differences in energy. And then, of course, like their first middle school romances and all this crazy stuff. So, yeah, like I said, I think we'll just have to break it down topic by topic. But I'd love to discuss that as far as how to handle all of those changes.
Okay. Well, let's talk about mental health then to start with. So, a lot of kids suffer with mental health issues around this age because of anxiety or peer pressure. Social media can be huge. What do you identify, or how can pediatricians and teachers work together to identify and address these mental health concerns?
Well, I think the mental health concerns are different than what we've had to deal with in the past because of the mix in with social media and the rapid spread of information throughout middle school and high school, because now they have phones. So it used to be in the past that they'd play like telephone, right? And when I say telephone, I just mean pass one message to the other or pass notes to someone else. And then that note grows bigger and bigger and more dramatic as time goes on. But now they have this access to kind of instant information. And so, like, one thing that we've done in schools to help with mental health and to help them be in the moment of, let's say, learning, or be in the moment of, let's say, like social communication, is we've eliminated phones from our school completely. They're not allowed. So that has been a huge change. And like I said, I think how quickly you can shame somebody when you get them in that moment and it spreads like wildfire. There's no time for that rumor to die down before it kind of dissipates. And so as far as parents go, I think a big part of that is helping their child learn how to use their phone properly and also to be the example. And that goes along with us as teachers, or you as a science communicator, doctor. You're never going to be inside of a visit with your phone sitting there typing away, right? And
Mhm.
so teaching them how to be in the moment, I think, really helps with mental health. We had to live in the moment when we were younger. We had to talk face to face. There was no this intermediary device between us and our best friend unless it was a phone call. And we couldn't even message. We didn't even have email at that time. And so this instant message and instant images that we can share with each other, a lot of that instant messaging and quick messages ends up becoming meaningless. It's not necessarily a conversation. And so that does, I think, hurt relationships, which can also hurt their mental health, because there's a lot less meaning in the communication that they're having with their peers, or possibly even, I think, maybe less meaning in the communication that they're having with their parents, if that's the only way that they're getting a hold of their parents all day long. We, and I hate to say when I was your age, because now I'm dating myself, as we all do, but when we saw our parents, that's when we saw them. Rarely ever did we call our parents on the phone unless we just needed to be picked up from somewhere. But we go home, we would have a conversation. You would sit down at dinner with your parents and talk about your day.
Mhm.
That's, I think, a large part of helping somebody with their mental health that's at that age and they're still developing. When you have conversations with your kids, and they'll know how to have conversations with other people, including their peers. Anyways, that's kind of where I
Well,
would start off.
yeah, I agree. I think you've made a lot of good points, including you've pointed to mindfulness. And there is a lot of good evidence that being in the moment, AKA being mindful of the moment, it can really help with anxiety and depression. And there's a lot of studies around specifically mindfulness based stress reduction, yoga, progressive muscle relaxation, a lot of techniques that kids can do to learn how to stay relaxed and to balance their parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems, which are fight flight nervous systems with our calming systems. And I think you're also pointing to a difference in communication style and learning, this is a new age where there's instant communication to all the peers, and this can be really stressful for kids um, with Snapchat and rumors and pictures. And there's a lot of pressure in social media that, growing up in the 80s and 90s, I didn't have to deal with. And thank goodness I didn't have to, because how do we address those things? And so that kind of leads us into what can parents do to help their kids deal with social media? I, for one, will recommend limiting the time on the devices. So, phone, text, computer, iPad, all of that to less than 2 hours a day if possible. Obviously, there's homework and things that have to get done. And I think that sometimes can be stressful for parents because they're not sure how to balance their kids' homework needs with the screen time. And how do you address that with your kids in the classroom?
Well, I started classroom teaching. So I did a lot of, obviously, like paraeducating and being an assistant in a special ed classroom, and of course subbing, all before 2020, the pandemic,
Mhm.
right? And then my first year after my getting my teaching degree, I started in the middle of the pandemic, and so we were only on screen, so it was what was required. But after that, we go back into school and we've transferred all of our files over digitally. Before that, it was mostly paper. Transfer everything digitally, and we got used to it. And we were on the computer all day long in all of our classes. And so there was no escape from the screen that
Mhm.
we had. And what I ended up doing, not just for my students, but for myself, of course, was transferring those assignments back to paper. And so I went fully back to paper unless we were typing a final draft of an essay, because I knew that every other class they were still going to be on computers. And I saw a shift where students had, it was almost like this connection to the physical world where you've got this piece of paper while you're writing on it and you're making that connection with the words that you're writing down. There was more effort there was more engagement with the discussions that we were having. If I taught them how to do notes, it wasn't just going online and copying and pasting stuff into a document. It was handwritten notes, and they'd go through and then they'd have discussions and they'd have their notes out in front of them and they would talk to their partner in front of them. I think that really does help. So if we're talking about parents, I understand that they can limit what their child can do at home. And oftentimes it's going to be, you have to do this thing online, and that's just how it is. However, if we're talking about teachers and what they can do, I'd encourage other teachers to move back to paper in the classroom. It does improve their motor skills. It does improve their memory when they write stuff down. It helps them remember more than just typing on the keys. And I know that there's been studies on this. I wish I could point out to them, and I'm sure I could find some out there. But there have been studies where if you do type, you actually memorize less than if you are handwriting. And I'm not sure if that just has to do with the motions of your hands versus punching keys straight down. But yeah, I think that's a big part of getting your kid off the screen.
Yeah.
Is it's not just the parents, but it also has to do with the education that they're getting at school as well. And sometimes that's out of the hands of the parents.
Yeah, but and also to your point though, there may be times where it's helpful with memorization or with learning math or learning how to write, that perhaps it could be helpful for parents to encourage their kids to shift away from typing an essay to writing one by hand, to doing their math homework by hand. There are definitely benefits to using physical objects, and that lends itself to or points to the fact that we are three-dimensional beings, and so it's interesting to see how our brains and bodies cope with this sort of other virtual dimension that we were never we've never gotten used to over the years. And so that being said, I definitely do think that having a three-dimensional object in your hand would lend itself to cognitive improvements. So that's a really great point. Um, that sort of leads me into something else I wanted to talk about, which was nutrition. And so, as a pediatrician, I'm very focused on nutrition. However, a lot of people don't realize that nutrition plays a huge part in learning, in cognition, and also in behavior. And the reason for that is we actually need those physical building blocks of whatever we're eating to make the cells in our body. So we're actually making the cells, we're making the hormones, we're making all these proteins in our brain. And what are we making this out of? We're making them out of the food. And so I focus on that a lot because if we are running our premium car on, fat from the fryer at McDonald's, it's not going to run very well. And the same is true for our bodies. If we're running our bodies on this kind of, diet of saturated fat, white bread, processed foods and sugars, in general, we're not making our cells well and we're not making our chemicals well. And we're trying to make our bodies run on something it was never meant to run on. And how do you see that playing out in the classroom with people that are eating or kids that are eating a lot of processed foods?
Yeah, I'm at a school where we're responsible for those kids the entire day at school, except for our prep period. And so we are responsible to go out and sit with them while they're eating lunch. I'll walk around the tables, and take a look and ask kids what they're eating. And when you have 100 sixth graders in a single spot and you see the types of foods that they're bringing to school, and it may be all that, a parent knows how to make. But when you see what they're eating, it kind of breaks your heart because, hot Cheetos and Takis and cookies and soda and, fruit snacks that aren't real fruit, right? You see that going into their body. And then when they re-enter the classroom after recess, even though they've had a little bit of time to burn off that energy, it's not gone. And their brains are completely wild and they're not prepared for learning. So when I see the kids, and I will say this is very honest assessment, is when you see kids who come in and they've got their cucumbers and they've got their hummus and they've got their chickpeas and they've got their carrots and they've got their rolled turkey slices and lettuce. Those kids often are the most well-behaved kids in my class, and not just behavior. When I say well-behaved, I'm not talking about somebody who's willing to conform and to all the rules of the classroom, but well-behaved as engaged and focused and ready to learn and willing to learn, and is able to absorb the information much better in their brain because their body is not ready to shoot off the walls. They have energy, but it's brain energy to learn. It's not body energy that's taking
Mhm.
them off into separate spaces. And the same goes for kids who come in before school and haven't had anything at all to eat. So we see those kids come in and immediately, they're hitting the table, their heads down,
Mhm.
struggling to stay awake during the lesson. And I'm sure, most people know that breakfast is the most important meal of the day. Whatever energy they have that they've consumed in that morning is going to get them through that day. And, you've got 3 periods before you even have lunch. So if you haven't eaten breakfast, that's a long time to go without food. And
Mhm.
as much as a kid doesn't want to eat in the morning, there has to be some sort of, I'm not saying forcefulness, but there has to be some sort of compromise that you can make with that child to get them to eat something that's at least healthy enough. Most kids will eat eggs, um, you know, so there are options. Most kids will eat oatmeal if it's got some fruit in it or something, and it's not bland and boring, but something to get them going to last those through those first 3 periods of the day. Otherwise, they'll just crash in the morning.
Yeah, that's very interesting that you point that out and that you are noticing changes with their learning and behavior in school based on the nutrition that they've had. And in fact, that goes along with the medical aspect of food. So often, what happens is when you don't eat, your body starts producing neurotransmitters or hormones that help mobilize sugar in the body. And that would be your catecholamines like epinephrine and norepinephrine. And that makes you wired. Another name for epinephrine is adrenaline. So you can imagine you're just wired and wired and wired. And then what happens? You just completely crash. So it almost can look like kids have things like ADHD, attention deficit disorder, or ADD, attention deficit hyperactive disorder, or attention deficit disorder, as it used to be called. Now it's just ADHD with different subtypes. But in any case, it mirrors the experience of the body, where the body's trying to compensate by mobilizing sugar from the liver, from the glycogen in the liver, and then crashing because it's not able to um, it'll need more sugar because the brain runs on sugar. Um, that leads me into what I wanted to touch on, what you were talking about with sleep, because you had mentioned, there's these kids that will come in and just crash. And, as we well know, sleep is critical for academic success, and it can be really challenging at this time because kiddos are going through some of those developmental changes where it can be difficult for them to go to bed early. But what do you see in the learning environment when kids have had a good night's sleep versus not the night before?
Oh, I mean, a kid that has not had a good night's sleep the night before, they're missing out on the lesson. Their head may be up, but they're not necessarily paying attention. And, for a lot of these kids, because they're still learning executive function skills, they don't necessarily understand what that has done to them. They may feel, because their body's running off of adrenaline, that they don't need a lot of sleep. Like in their opinion, I'm fine, is what I've heard. I'm fine. I could stay up all night and still, be awake and ready to learn in the classroom. And yet they're not really actually absorbing the material, which is kind of tragic in a way.
Mhm.
And most of these kids, it's because they've been staying up all night on their phones. And, to be honest, this is something that we probably all do a little bit. And those kids see the example. And if someone else is doing it who is older than them, they think it's also okay for them to do it. So I think as far as like sleep habits go, that has to be established, in my opinion, earlier so that those kids understand what that routine looks like. And it needs to be established as a family. And I understand not all families can do that. You've got parents that have graveyard shifts, and that's completely understandable. But for those who are in the household with them and those who do have the same schedule as them, um, people should do their best, in my opinion, to try to be on the same schedule. Otherwise, it's very difficult when someone else is awake downstairs eating food and watching TV, and that kid is expected to go to sleep.
Mhm.
So, in their eyes, what I've heard from some kids, it's not fair. My parents, made me go to sleep at this time. They stay up all night. Okay. So, what are we going to do as the adults to set that example and set those routines to show them that it's actually good for their body and it's also good for us as adults?
Mhm. Yeah, I do think that there is something to be said for creating good sleep hygiene at night and creating routines that lead to proper sleep. And some of the strategies that I recommend often are dimming the lights, um, also decreasing the temperature to about 68 degrees, making it nice and cool so that the body is ready to sleep. And then employing other strategies like a nice chamomile tea, reading a little bit, and making sure the kid is getting sleepy in the place that they are actually going to stay asleep. Sometimes I see um, issues where kids will fall asleep on, in one location, such as the sofa or in mom's bed. And then when they're transferred to the new location, it can be difficult to get back to sleep. So if they are sleepy, I recommend moving them to the place that they will fall asleep to complete the sleep routine. To your point, I do think that sleep is especially important in the cases of kids that are neurodiverse. And I hope you don't mind if I disclose to the public, but you yourself are neurodiverse. Would you like to tell us about that and what your
Yeah.
experience growing up was?
Um, my experience growing up, ADHD runs heavily in my family. We've had multiple members diagnosed, and some of us are medicated. I am not. However, I didn't necessarily get the help that I needed when I was younger. And so I had to manage my way through school, like learn those skills along the way, which could be really, really hard. If you don't have the help along the way, then you're failing all the way up to the point where you find out what works for you, but there's a lot of years lost. And so you're always playing catch up. And so, did I have proper sleep times? No. I lived in a house of, there's 10 kids in my family. So we are a very big family, and it was a very noisy house all the time. Eventually, I learned how to sleep with all the noise, and now I can't go to sleep without noise. So that's a very difficult thing. Ellie will tell you, I put like one earphone in and I fall asleep to Carl Sagan, whatever, talking. Like that helps me because that's what I found that helps me with my ADHD. And it's something that I've heard before. So it puts me to sleep in like 5 to 10 minutes and I'm out. So that's something that has helped me along the way. And I think for anybody who may have any kind of, disorder or whatever it is to find something that works for them, because I don't think there's a one size fits all solution. So it's about finding what works for you. And for me, in my ADHD, I have found what helps me function in life. And it may not be the same executive function skills, same sleep skills, same study skills as someone else, but it does work for me. And I think that's important.
Yeah, and I think that you may have some pointers when it comes to how you're helping kids in the classroom and also outside of the class with homework. What strategies do you use to help kids that are neurodivergent with things like ADHD or autism spectrum inside of the classroom?
So, in the side of the classroom, the strategies I use, we have something called universal design for learning, and most teachers nowadays are learning it. It's usually part of your curriculum when you go through college and get your teaching credential. And that's employing as many different supports as possible into your curriculum, each lesson, so that every kid can be involved. And that is a very difficult thing. So I'm not saying that it's fully possible to get every single kid engaged, but if it's graphic organizers where you're breaking down, let's say, a paragraph, into its various parts. So you start off with a hook or an introduction that gets the reader engaged. Then I might have some sentence starters for those kids to get them to understand, what a hook looks like, what a sentence starter looks like for that specific thing. And then I go down and then I'll say, okay, well, next you're going to give me just a brief summary of what you're writing about. If it's a compare and contrast about a book, then you'll give me like a 3 to 5 sentence summary. And then after that, go down and you give your opinion, your thesis. And this helps them because it seems extremely daunting and confusing and a jumbled mess when you just tell a kid, hey, you're writing a compare and contrast essay. Make sure you've got your introduction, your thesis, and your body paragraphs and your conclusion without any kind of structure. And structure is something that needs to be repeated over and over again. Sentence starters, while some teachers may feel like it's too much help, the more that they look at those sentence starters, eventually they'll start to make them their own and they'll start to modify things. And so including those types of tools in the classroom is helpful. Other tools that we also use, and I'm using those even more so now, if we have kids who have severe dyslexia, usually there is some kind of help that, like a paraeducator or somebody who can push into the classroom for 30 minutes and help them along the way with their reading skills or pull them out for their reading skills. But they also need to be able to be a part of the classroom. And so we'll start to use, that kid may have a computer with a headset on them. And in order to get their ideas quick enough to follow along with the class, they'll do speech to text. And they'll just do it quietly while they're doing their notes in class. And it gets down on the page, and it doesn't always come in perfectly, but that's where they're allowed to practice. And they take that home and practice either with their parents or a brother or sister to clean up their notes. So the things that they said that they can now see that are wrong, they can go back and they can correct, which is great.
Yeah, and for everyone that doesn't know, dyslexia is a learning disability that leads kids to often jumble their letters. And a related disorder is dyscalculia, where kiddos jumble their numbers. And I know you have personal experience with that as well.
Yeah, my technique that I learned growing up, as far as being somebody who's lived with dyslexia, and Ellie will tell you, I always, I'll be reading something out loud. She's reading the exact same thing, and then all of a sudden I say a word that's totally different. It's not even the word that's on the page. The best thing that I've been able to find that works for me, and I taught this to other students, is to read out loud, but not just read out loud, but try to find a character's voice to read in. And when you do that, you read slower, you try to find intonation, and you follow along that word a little bit slower as you're reading. And it's not to read slower, it's just to give it a character. And I did a little bit of acting in high school and a little bit of acting in college. And it can be very difficult for a kid to act out a voice while they're reading the thing that they're reading. But it does definitely make you pay attention more to what you're reading and to get the emotion and feeling behind it. But you also pay attention to the words.
Mhm.
And I think it probably helps a little bit more with sight reading. So yeah, that's what I've been able to do for myself. And if a kid takes it, awesome. And if they don't, they'll find, the tools that work for them so long as we provide them.
Mhm. And so there are some tools in schools for getting kids the supports that they need. And often I've referred kids back to the school for either a 504 or an individualized education program, an IEP. Can you talk a little bit about just how that process looks if a parent does think their child might need a 504 or an IEP, and what the difference between those two are?
Yeah, so an IEP would be for somebody who is on the spectrum and needs a bit more help. And oftentimes, the type of help they'll get, which is what I was saying, things like speech to text, or they will have a paraeducator that's paired with them that helps them out through every class. That paraeducator may be there to help them take notes as they're in the classroom. If that kid doesn't have the ability to soak in all the information in that moment, they do have those notes later on to refer to. That usually starts off with teacher receives some sort of survey and we go through it, and it can be like a 200 question survey. So that teacher needs to use their prep period to fill that all out. And some of the questions can be repetitive, but it will have things like has trouble staying in seat, has trouble staying focused in class, often fidgeting with objects, standing up, walking around, distracting other students, or they themselves are looking out the window or laying on the ground, whatever it is. They'll have all these different questions along the way. They'll ask you about like their social emotional learning. They'll ask you about their relationships that they have in school. And so once you get through that process, they set up an initial meeting, and it'll either be for a 504 or an IEP. A 504, some of the things that you would see on that is a student is fully capable of accessing the curriculum usually, and then they'll have extra time on assignments. So like maybe 50% extra time or 100% extra time. Or for most of their classes, they're doing fine, but they might be a little bit behind on reading. And so they would get like a pull out for reading for 30 minutes and read one-on-one with a paraeducator, and that person will help them try to get up to speed and also help them get caught up on the assignments that they were missing in class while they were pulled out. And so 504 is a bit more mild. IEP is for students who need a lot more help in order to access that curriculum. And I've seen various ranges of IEPs, and I've seen various ranges of 504s. But it is a plan that is agreed upon between the parents, the student, who is usually in those meetings, the teachers, and the school. And it's a legally binding contract. So what is said inside of that document is something that must be followed. So I would say, in my advice to parents out there to understand what that means is, if you're asking something and you know for sure that it cannot be achieved within the classroom, that you ask for a paraeducator if that's what that child needs. And if that's in the document, that's what they will get. If the school can't provide them that paraeducator, the school needs to let the parents know that they don't have access to that. And if that's the case, then the district needs to get on it and find someone. So and this is a problem with the system. Okay. So I'm talking about learning how to understand how to navigate the system. And I know there are a lot of frustrated parents out there. As a teacher, you have 25 to 40 kids in each class, and you have 4 or 5 classes a day. And you've got 55 minutes to teach all of those kids in that class, and then they move through and filter out and move through and filter out. And the reality is there's only so much universal design for learning that you can fit into a lesson before you can't even teach the lesson anymore. And I know that's a difficult thing to hear. And you definitely should advocate for your child, if it is absolutely necessary, to have someone else in the classroom with them to help them navigate that classroom and get through it. Otherwise, I can tell you it can be very difficult to get the help they need just from that teacher who is in charge of teaching the other 25 kids in class. If you have 25 kids, you've got 2 minutes per kid if you're not teaching your lesson to give them one-on-one attention. If you're teaching your lesson, you might have 30 seconds per kid. So think about that first before you think about what you will place on a teacher versus what your kid might actually need that the teacher cannot provide. And that's, I think, a reality that I want to get through.
So
And I
what
will
I'm
do everything in
hearing
my power to help every kid in my class, if it's possible.
Yeah, and so what I'm hearing is, due to the limitations in time and resources for a single teacher, it is important that if a child does have needs such as one-on-one tutoring or one-on-one support, that parents do advocate that they get that one-on-one support. And the name of the person that helps get one-on-one support or gives the one-on-one support would be somebody called a paraeducator. So parents, make sure that you are asking for that if that is in fact what your kiddo needs. Good point there. So this kind of brings me to the next thing that I want to talk about, which was social life. So this is a crazy time for kids, right? They're moving away from their parent group, their primary family, whatever that may look like, and they're moving into creating some separation. Um, and they're starting to create these strong peer relationships. And how can we support them, with all of these self esteem changes and puberty related emotional um, differences that happen? How do you see that we can best support kids? Or how can parents support kids at home? And how can we support kids in the classroom with those new and ongoing needs?
I think it's important, honestly, is to bring ourselves back to that moment that we were that same age. We may not see, a relationship as the end of the world. It hurts, and we know it hurts, but we've been through it before in our lives. And you may think two sixth graders holding hands together isn't a big deal, and they dated for 5 days, and then there's a breakup, and their world crumbles, and you're like, oh, get over it. You were together for 5 days, right? It may not seem like a lot, but to them, you have to remember that every time they do something new, it's the first time they're doing it. And we may have gone through it 20 or 50 times in our lives by that point. And we look back and say, toughen up, kid, or whatever it is. The reality is, if you at least show some kind of empathy and let them know that you feel for them and that it probably is a very big deal to them, let them know that. I mean, I will say, for me, my first breakup, I was like 17, and I did not date this person for very long. And what my sister did for me, she took me out and she bought me ice cream and asked if I wanted to talk about it. And that, to me, was one of the most helpful things in that moment, to not necessarily just to get over it, but to help process it. So we can do the same thing for kids. I know I see these kids in school all the time. I see them clearly more than their parents do in school all the time. So I see their interactions there for 6 or 7 hours a day. And I see the relationships that they are in, right? And I see them when they're hurting. And if they're in the classroom and there's a tear in their eye, or if they have their head down, something has happened. And so, am I going to go over and get on that kid for not paying attention in the middle of a lesson? No. Usually what I'll do is I'll write a little post-it note. Hey, if you need a moment, just let me know. You can step out in the hall if you need it, whatever, take a breath. If you want to go see the counselor, fine. And I just give them a post-it note, and then they'll look back up at me because I don't want to bring the attention to them in class. So it's just walking by and slipping it on their desk. They'll look at me and I'll look at them, and then they'll either give me like a head nod, like I need to go see the counselor, or no, I'm okay. And they'll just kind of give me a hand gesture. So as teachers, that's what we can do, is always understand that life is hard for them, even though they don't have jobs and pay taxes and all these different things, because everything is new. And I hope that parents can see that as they build these skills. And it takes time, I'm sure.
Yeah, and I do think that, to your point, reflecting the emotion back to the child is helpful to validate what they are going through. And then I also recommend asking open ended questions. Sometimes kids are receptive to that, and sometimes they just need a little bit of time to process. Um, However, I do think that continuing to check in and ask is always good advice as well. Um, this kind of moves us into another topic about how can we empower, preteens and teens to advocate for their own health and education. So, and, from my perspective, I love it when kids come in with questions, and I'm so happy that they feel empowered to ask, because it is so important moving forward that preteens and teens learn how to advocate for themselves, so that when they are adults, they are able to speak to, um, different people in their lives, like physicians or obstetricians, a type of physician that delivers babies, other quote unquote authority figures so that they can make sure they're getting their needs met. So, what in your world can preteens and teens do to help, or parents do to help empower these preteens and teens to advocate for themselves in education? What things are important in the classroom, or what would you like to see um, kids doing?
Well, for me, the most important thing is to create a safe space for them to ask questions where they will never feel like they are dumb for asking a question. And I got that, I watched Cosmos. Carl Sagan talks about that. Kids are the greatest scientists, right? They ask questions, they break things because they're trying to figure out how they're working, right? Or what will happen, the causation effect. Throw a glass bowl off the table and see what happens, and they see it happen, and that's an opportunity for them to learn. Obviously you don't want to tell them, hey, that's okay, you can do another one and another one, right? Eventually they'll understand, like, oh, that was a bad thing, I probably shouldn't do that again. But it's not a moment to shame somebody. Anytime, like, they're trying to experiment with something, or anytime they want to ask a question, like, why is the sky blue? And it's like, well, that's a stupid question, kid. Why would you ask that question, right? So if we create a space where they can ask a question without feeling shame or guilt for not knowing the answer to that question, they asked it for a reason. They don't know. And so the best thing we can do is say, that's a fantastic question, and give them an honest answer that is age appropriate wherever they're at in their learning, and wherever they're at in their growth. Give them the best answer that they can understand in that moment. And then if you don't know the answer as an adult, and there's no one that knows the answer, right? The right question, or the right response for me, would be something like, that's a great question, I'm not sure what the answer is to that. Maybe you'll be the person to find that out. And that can be really encouraging for a kid to continue and seek in learning, in life or in the classroom, if it's academic, versus asking a question and saying, wrong, who else can help, so-and-so answer this question, because they weren't listening. Shaming a kid in the moment, that never helps, and that shuts them down completely. And so the best thing we can say, you're really close. I think you're on the right track. Let's go ahead and continue to build on this question, and then go off and start asking, other kids in the class. And that way everybody comes to an understanding together. And what I say and my responses may not resonate with that kid. So the best thing I can do is ask somebody else in the classroom for their understanding of how they would explain it. What's another way we can explain this? And so eventually, perhaps it's in a language that one of their peers helps them understand, versus my language as the adult.
Hmm. I do think that's a great point, keeping the communication open and giving a lot of encouragement to kids as they mature. And I do think it's interesting that you do talk about peer-to-peer conversation, because many people do have siblings in their home, and sometimes that sibling may be able to explain a concept a little bit better than an adult can, simply because they're closer in age and they're able to use vocabulary that we may not think to use. Well, Mr. Jeffrey Root, I want to be respectful of both of our times. It is the day before Thanksgiving, so happy Thanksgiving. And we've covered a lot today. We've talked about the importance of sleep, nutrition, how much we need to encourage kids to try to stay off of social media and phones, how to navigate IEPs in healthcare, and how to encourage teens and preteens to advocate for their own health and education. So thank you for all of those tips and information, and maybe you'll be on again. I certainly hope so.
We'll see. Of course, anytime.
Wishing you well. Bye, guys.
Bye.